All right, we'll kick things under and get underway. Thank you very much to everyone for attending today. Great to have such a great number of people joining us. It's our pleasure to have David Dewar with us today, the new Trade Commissioner for the Pacific, based in Fiji. It's for those who haven't attended an open mic night concept before. Today's really around everyone getting the opportunity to have their say, share about their experience of what's happening in the markets right now. David's going to give a brief overview to start the event, and then we'll be opening it up. So as we work through, encourage everyone to be asking questions through the Slido app, either within Teams or on the website as we go. And then as we move into the more of the open mic part, if you want to raise your hand, just like that, when you've got something to speak on, and then either David or myself will take you guys off mute, and then we'll start the conversation from there. So first of all, just a little bit about the New Zealand Pacific Business Council. We're a not-for-profit, volunteer-run organisation. We're looking at promoting bilateral trade between New Zealand and the Pacific Islands, and we encourage all of those of you who aren't currently members to look at joining our membership as we push forward with a couple of exciting projects over the next 12 months to really integrate what we're doing and promote the bilateral trade message. We've got a small video to show you from some of our executive, which is really about encouraging people to get involved. So there's an opportunity at our AGM coming up at the end of November, early December, for people to put their hand up and get involved, which is a really amazing way to make connections, entrench yourself within the trade in the Pacific. And for me personally, I find it a great way to give back. So let's roll the video, Rona.
Kia ora, my name is Daniel Ludlam. I'm the Managing Director of Timber Baron, a bulk building materials supplier into the South Pacific.
Hi, I'm Catherine Sumter. I'm also the Vice Chair of the New Zealand Pacific Business Council, and I'm also a commercial lawyer. I have clients who come from the French Pacific territories.
Hi, my name is Greg Fuller, and I work for Fletcher Construction South Pacific.
My name's Bob Weston from Entech. We design and manufacture equipment for electrical infrastructure projects.
One of the key things for our business in joining the Pacific Business Council really has been to connect with like-minded individuals, particularly business owners, for shared experiences and build connections of people within New Zealand who are exporting and also with businesses that are in the Pacific.
I wanted to get a better understanding of how to do business in the Pacific, but also get business exposure and be able to be part of a wider network, business network in New Zealand, but also in the Pacific.
Our membership of the New Zealand Pacific Business Council has given me
access to people and organisations, Pacific markets,
specifically potential customers, potential suppliers, and people from other organisations that
share an alignment in promoting potential opportunities and developing and maintaining relationships.
Those networks and connections are truly powerful, and the opportunity to give back and help support other businesses that are wanting to get involved in the Pacific has been truly invaluable.
You get to attend webinars, networking events, and increase your business exposure by being a member.
Encourage anyone who's interested in joining to click the link below.
Come and join us.
Awesome. That's our little sales pitch for you guys, but I would encourage everyone to engage with us, at least through the website. Get involved with our newsletters so you can keep in touch with what's going on. But ultimately, as a not-for-profit volunteer organisation, really encourage people to sign up a very small fee for an annual membership for the great value that we're able to provide. So there's a link in the Q&A for anyone who wants to join. Without further ado, I'll pass over to David to introduce himself. I'm sure many of you know him already from his past exploits at MFAT and commitment to the region so far. So I'll pass over to David.
Kia ora, Daniel, and hello, everyone. Can you give me a thumbs up if you can hear me? Fantastic. Well, look, thank you so much for the invitation to address the council today. Daniel very kindly sent me a list of some of the confirmed attendees, and I know we've got a very prestigious group of people on the line here today, so I might just do a few sort of acknowledgements. Firstly, of course, to Daniel, the chair of the Pacific Business Council, and to Christine, who have been instrumental in setting this up. I think we might have some presidents of some of the other Pacific Business Councils. I know that Chanda Sen was one of the attendees. So Chanda, if you're here, I'd like to acknowledge you as well, being on the line. Some of the colleagues that we have from other trade agencies from other countries and jurisdictions active throughout the region, so particularly Pacific Trade Invest, Austrade, and colleagues also from New Caledonia as well. I'd like to acknowledge you on this call too, and thank you very much for dialing in. To everyone here who's an existing New Zealand Trade and Enterprise customer, and especially focus customers, I'd like to acknowledge you and thank you for dialing in. And of course, NZTE colleagues who are here with me. I see a few on the line, and also possibly some former colleagues as well. So one of the names I saw on the list was Beatrice Famuina, who of course was formerly our Consul General and Trade Commissioner in New York, and needs no introduction because of her prowess on the sporting field, of course, as well. So I was a bit starstruck to see your name here, and thank you very much also for being part of this. And one other special shout out that I'll do, I see my very good friend Kenzo Pinnell from World Rugby, who's on the line, and he's also holding my godson, Hugo. So hi Hugo, and thank you for being here too, all the way from Waiheke. So look, everyone, really appreciate the opportunity to speak to you about NZTE in the Pacific. And I have prepared a sort of slideshow which I will share with you and speak into that. So I'll just do my share screen now. We ran through it before and it looks like it works. So thumbs up if you can see the slideshow there on your screen. Excellent. Okay, so NZTE in the Pacific, as you will have seen, a fair bit of media around the announcement of the new Trade Commission office when we managed to get that over the line back in April, and of course my appointment in August this year. Perhaps a little bit about NZTE for those who aren't existing customers. So what we are the New Zealand Government's international business development and investment attraction agency. That makes us slightly different, I guess, from traditional trade promotion agencies in that we work very directly with individual companies on helping them with their, I guess, export journey. And that includes support predominantly actually at the New Zealand end around becoming export ready, and then in market in our sort of international markets around the world, which is where trade commissioners and business development managers like myself come into play. We're a customer driven organization, so NZTE works with around 5,000 export customers. Those are New Zealand companies. And that's a subset, I guess, of the 10,000 or so New Zealand exporting companies that are in New Zealand. Of that, there are 1,400 what we call focus customers, which are those who have reached, I guess, a certain point on the sort of export continuum and keen to work with us more intensively. That was up until last year, that was 700 customers, and it's been expanded and doubled really to 1,400, which reflects the government's decision to vest NZTE with the delivery of the trade recovery strategy as a response to COVID. We apply a philosophy, I guess, called the customer way, which refers really, I think, to that wraparound support that we provide to our customers, both in New Zealand and offshore. So people that we work with have teams in New Zealand that work in support, and also teams are out in offshore markets. And the Pacific, of course, is the latest market that we've opened up that in-market capability, which is me. We apply a benefit to New Zealand test. So those that we work with don't strictly have to be domiciled within New Zealand. The test that we apply is really, are those companies providing a net benefit to New Zealand? So it may be that they're domiciled in another market, but a significant portion of their workforce is employed in New Zealand, or they run a particular regional market out of a New Zealand operation and are a major employer or economic player in the economy here. So that's just another relevant criteria to be aware of. Now, PAC team, it's not just me. There are a few of us, and some of these people you may know. So when we talk about the way NZTE divides its operations, the Pacific is covered out of the Australia and Pacific region. So I report into the regional director for Australia and the Pacific, who's a person by the name of Glenn Murphy. And we have a couple of colleagues that I work with very closely around support for customers in the Pacific region. The one on the far right, who's not with us today because he's just welcomed a baby girl yesterday, is Scott James, who's our Australia and Pacific market manager. So I'm sure many of you will have worked with Scott either directly or in his capacity as actually being, I think, an ex officio member of the council or an associate member of the business council. The other one I'd like to introduce is my colleague in the middle there, Kath Cooksley Little, and I might just quickly put her on the spot because I know that she is on the line. So Kath, if you wanted to just perhaps come off mute quickly to introduce yourself, because Kath comes from a long background in the Pacific as well.
Hi, kia ora and talofa. My name's Kath, and so I'm the Regional Marcoms Manager for Australia and the Pacific, based in Sydney. I am similar to David, relatively new to NZTE, so just coming up just over 2 months. And before that, I used to work with Pacific Trade Invest Australia, so supporting businesses from the Pacific with trade investment and also tourism into Australia. So I'm really excited to be part of the Pacific team and looking to use, I guess, my good connections, both in media and throughout the Pacific and in Australia, to support New Zealand businesses get a better reach and flow in there.
Kia ora, Kath. Thank you very much for that. And so, yeah, we're really, really fortunate to have someone of Kath's experience and with her, connections and expertise as part of our broader team. Kath's marketing and communications team, of course, is responsible for both Australia and the Pacific, but to have that Pacific expertise that she brings is really valuable, not just to me, but also to broader NZTE and, of course, the companies that we work with. And then myself, so I've recently joined NZTE. Immediately prior to the Trade Commissioner position, I was working as NZTE's Pacific Project Lead for the last year, based here in Suva, which was really about re-establishing the office here. There's quite a bit of effort goes into re-establishing a new offshore office. You have to get all sorts of diplomatic approvals, work through those with New Zealand MFAT, with the host government, in this case Fiji, and of course getting ministerial and cabinet approvals and things like that. So that was a process that took several months, and of course it had started several years beforehand. This is something that hasn't just happened overnight. It's something that NZTE has been planning for quite some time. You'll be aware that we haven't had an office in the South Pacific region outside of Papua New Guinea for the last 10 years, actually. Many of you will probably be familiar with Peter Hobbs, who was up until recently our High Trade Commissioner in Port Moresby, focusing solely at that stage on the Papua New Guinea market. Peter, of course, up until recently would have been also represented on this slide as well, because he was an integral part of our Pacific team up until his recent retirement. So he's now moved up to Hawke's Bay, but we still keep in touch, and he's been a great asset as well. So the decision that we've made in shifting the office away from Port Moresby and back into Suva has been one, I think, that reflects our wanting to take a regional approach to the Pacific region. And in doing that, Fiji is really the logical place to base your operation. It's by far our largest trading partner in the Pacific, accounting for about a third of our exports into the region. It's the commercial, political, economic hub, and it's where the vast majority of New Zealand businesses and New Zealanders tend to go into the region from. So it's the easiest place for us to be based in order to maintain that sort of regional strategy that we're hoping to take. So the Pacific. Now, this is a slide that probably won't be of news to anyone on this call, but it's something that I've really been trying to hammer home, I think, to the people that we talk with around government and in the broader sort of NZTE and business community. Why the Pacific matters, it is a very significant strategic priority for New Zealand and for the New Zealand government. We don't need to really traverse all of the obvious geographical, the whānau cultural links to the region to know why it's a sort of a government policy priority. But from an NZTE and a trade perspective, notwithstanding all of that, it's a really big market in its own right. So prior to COVID, New Zealand was exporting around $2.2 billion of trade into the region. We were getting around $1.2 billion back. So really significant economic market. If you took the entire region together, it would be between our 6th or 7th largest trading partner. So really significant. And it's also a region where a lot of New Zealand companies, unlike other parts of the world, are actually physically present. They're market dominant in many sectors, and they're operating in a huge range of goods and services. So it's a place where New Zealand matters, and it's a place that really matters to us from a trade perspective. And then, of course, outside of the business to business, the standard trading flows, there's also a really significant aid and development agenda in the region, around about $3 billion worth, which is spent. And that's just by organisations that New Zealand companies regularly interact with. So that's the New Zealand government, the Australian government, the Asian Development Bank, and World Bank. So huge opportunities for New Zealand companies in a broad range of sectors. This just sort of makes that same point again around the pre-COVID export value to New Zealand. That export mix is quite a relevant one as well. So a 70 to 30 split goods to services. That's actually a really diverse and good mix. As opposed to other markets where the trade is dominated by sort of agricultural commodities. Into the Pacific, we're exporting a huge range of goods and services, especially manufactured products, really sort of outsized importance in terms of that market, and a heavy sort of services mix. In terms of the New Zealand portfolio, I mentioned those 1,400 focus customers. We've done a bit of a trawl internally, and we know that around 245 of them currently have an export interest in Pacific markets. So a really significant market also for our NZTE customer portfolio. I thought I'd have a quick slide touching on the impacts of COVID-19, and we can get back into this in the discussion later on. But at a headline level, obviously the region suffered tremendously from the impacts of the pandemic, and predominantly from, I guess, the mix of the health impacts in places like Fiji, which still has an ongoing outbreak, and the French Pacific, which has had a quite significant one in French Polynesia and just has quite a severe one developing in New Caledonia at the moment. But the major economic impact, of course, has been that cessation of travel, which is hugely decimated really the tourism industries, which a lot of Pacific economies were heavily reliant on, and that hits both primary tourism providers as well as a lot of secondary industries that service the resorts, whether it's everything from air conditioning all the way through to food and beverage and things like that. So overall 5.8% impact on GDP. Now that's skewed heavily, I think, by the fact that the Asian Development Bank also includes New Zealand in that calculation. So if you took New Zealand out, it would be even more severe on just Pacific Island economies. Our exports to the region have dropped by about 30%. And if you remember my 70-30 split, goods to services in an earlier slide, that basically indicates that the entire services piece has been wiped out, which really shows, I think, that how significant travel and travel-related services were into the region, and none of those are really happening with what's happened to tourism. On the plus side, the ADB at least is estimating that in 2022 we're going to be looking at around 4% GDP growth for the region. A lot of this is driven by its expectations for Papua New Guinea. That was a report that was released in July, and of course PNG is one of the largest sort of economies and populations in the region. There will be hugely mixed results I expect across the region. A lot of it's dependent on vaccinations and, of course, when tourism and travel can safely reopen. But if I think about Fiji, there are some really, really good news on the vaccination rate that's happened here. There's around 95% of the population already with a first dose. We've ticked over 65% on a second dose. They've started opening up internal borders on Viti Levu, and they are talking, and I think actually quite credibly now, about the country opening up to inbound tourism by the end of this year. So, you know, a lot of that has sort of ongoing risks, and we can never take anything for granted in the pandemic, as we know, but that's sort of the overall trajectory. In terms of market opportunities, when we talk about, you know, what we are really advising our customers about, in the near term, we expect that the main area of activity and the main area of opportunity is going to be those big aid and development programs that I mentioned earlier. So as the private sector is impacted by the economic situation in the region, we're expecting a lot of the big aid donors, the New Zealand, the Australian governments, and the multilateral development banks, to step in to fill, you know, a lot of that activity gap. There's a huge infrastructure need in the region. I think some estimates have it at around sort of 30 to $40 billion worth of infrastructure investments required, and those big donors are going to be providing a lot of that. So when we talk about, you know, when we think about some of the sectors that are going to be relevant there, it'll be, you know, a lot of that construction, infrastructure, renewable energy, tech sort of space, and also services. And I've got a couple of slides just sort of breaking down some of the sectors where that aid and development work's likely to be relevant. When we think about food and beverage, and a lot of those industries that have been, you know, really focused on tourism, we're sort of thinking about those in kind of, I guess, the longer term, post-COVID environment, when economies start to reopen, when tourism restarts in the region. That being said, there is still a lot of consumer branded product from New Zealand that goes into the region. You know, we're a critical food provider for a lot of markets. And so, you know, you're talking to a lot of companies, there is still quite a lot of trade that's happening. But really, we are looking ahead to that tourism recovery to drive some of those opportunities. And so in the meantime, we're kind of thinking about some of the common, you know, customer needs, some of the commonly identified challenges that the companies we speak to are facing, and how we can meet those. And a lot of it really comes down to, you know, research, building capability advice, and just that perspective from having, I guess, boots on the ground, particularly for people that are unable to travel outside of New Zealand at the moment. This next slide really illustrates that point I was making about the growing aid and development agenda. So some of these figures are a little outdated. They're taken from a resource that's only current to 2018, but it does show a significant increase both in the overall quantums of aid spend in the region, and also just the sheer number of projects. So a lot of opportunity there. Average project size, I think, that $375,000 US mark. So, you know, some big scale opportunities in the region. And this is the breakdown by sector. So you'll see that really large line at the top talks about government and civil society. And that's really about capability building and capacity building for governments and for economies in the region. And so that, I think, illustrates the fact that when we talk about aid and development projects, it's not just about building solar farms or, you know, shipping steel or, you know, constructing buildings. It's also about a lot of those kind of consulting opportunities, training and education providers. And we've got some really successful companies that have been operating in that in those sectors as well. And a couple of these here really just illustrate, I think, the scale of some of the opportunities. So, you know, that one from the Fiji Sun, where we're talking about the largest solar project in the Pacific. There's a couple of New Zealand companies that I know were quite actively involved in that. That's a $15 million project at least. You know, the ADB unlocking about $150 million for projects in the transport network in the Solomons, and of course Australia committing an extra, you know, $500 million for COVID vaccine and health support in the region. Now, not all of these are, you know, funds are going to be translating directly into commercial opportunities for businesses. Many of them will go directly to some of those host governments, but there will be a lot of project opportunities. And I think the challenge for us is figuring out how to give better visibility and help our companies build capability to make sure that we're positioning ourselves most effectively for those. So these are the common challenges, what I just mentioned, basically. Giving that visibility of project pipeline is something that's really commonly identified as a major challenge. Companies often say, we're aware that there are all of these opportunities that are floating out there. There's a million websites to try and navigate. Most of them were announced a year ago, and there's sort of 18 months project, work that's sort of done in the background. The first we hear about it is either when the tender's already been awarded or with only 2 weeks to go. So really, I think what we're trying to focus on is how we can fill that gap a little bit by giving that better visibility of what's coming down the pipe, while at the same time, I think helping the companies we work with grow their capability and their connections into particularly the aid and development procurement world to better position for success there. So that brings us quickly to the strategy. Number one is we've really got to this point now. We've regionalised our footprint. So at the start, I mentioned we'd shifted an office from Port Moresby, which was solely focused on the Papua New Guinea market, to one that's now based in Suva and is looking at the region as a whole. That's both regionalising in terms of focus, but also regionalising in terms of the team. And I mentioned Kath, of course, who's within our Sydney team, Scott, who's in our Auckland team. We also have colleagues from Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade in Port Moresby, so wearing a commercial counsellor hat there, which is, I guess, maintaining that continuity of service to customers that are operating in that market, and that's working in as part of the team. And of course, we've got other sectoral, sector-specific expertise throughout our Australia and New Zealand offices that we're working very closely with as well. Secondly, and this is a bit more of an internal thing for NZTE, we're trying to consolidate and grow our customer portfolio. So we need to get a better handle on who the companies are that are operating in the Pacific, that are, that have ambitions there, that are recording successes, and that really reflects, NZTE's own internal KPIs. We are measured on the number of customers that we're working with on our books. We're measured on the deals that they are recording in those markets, and we're measured against the what we call international growth outcomes, or IGOs, which is where they're creating footholds or opportunities to expand in particular markets. So if we're not aware and if we're not actively working with and recording those companies, then it's not painting a great picture internally, and it won't help us get more resource, I think, down the track. So that's really an internal piece that we're working on, and it's really important that we have this visibility of the companies that are in the region and that they're engaging through the NZTE mechanisms that we've got. Number three are those new customer resources I was talking about. Something, new services really about improving that visibility of project pipeline. We're looking at sort of education and capability modules around helping people engage more effectively with aid programs. And also, I think, improving our network of what we call beachheads advisors, which are people, very experienced at operating in particular markets or sectors. We know we've got a huge amount of experience we can tap into in the Pacific, and bringing some of those people to bear to work with our customers, we think will be really powerful. And then fourth is, of course, working with our partners. So, I'm one person in the market. I'm working with a handful of others across the region and a really talented team, but we're still very small. And so that ability to work together with our partner organisations, other New Zealand agencies, other governments, colleagues like, from Austrade, Pacific Trade and Invest, and of course the business councils, is going to be really critical. So, working together is going to be absolutely essential to how we want to operate in the region, but also how we want to see our companies operating. So one of the really effective things, I think, a really important part of New Zealand's value proposition in the region is how effectively we do partner with people in the Pacific, with other governments and with other organisations and companies. And we want to encourage, I think, companies that are working there to keep that up and to sort of see how we can facilitate, I think, some of those connections that will help that. As an example, and here's a shout out for colleagues from Austrade who might be joining us today. we're looking into sort of co-delivered, co-branded events. We've got one coming up. First cab off the rank is taking place next week, which is a briefing that we're giving on a major renewable energy project funded by the Asian Development Bank in Kiribati. So that's something that we're very deliberately organising together with colleagues from Austrade, with the New Zealand High Commission and Australian High Commissions in Kiribati, and with the Asian Development Bank, bringing that kind of network approach together so that we can get the best possible product to get that information out there to New Zealand companies that are potentially interested. How we can work together. I'm coming to the end now. This is my second to last slide. First up, if you're an existing NZTE Focus customer, that's brilliant. Please get in touch if we haven't already spoken via your customer managers in NZTE. If you're not already an NZTE customer, please consider engaging through NZTE. Partly for me, this is a bit of a self-preservation appeal. I'm getting around about 60 emails a day and about 20 messages on LinkedIn. There is a huge amount of interest in working in the Pacific and a huge amount of people that are engaged. And my ability to kind of stay on top of that is going to get less and less over time. And so the more we can channel that through our existing NZTE operation, the easier it is for me, and the better we are able, I think, to help. So please, that's my appeal, to consider that, and I'll be happy to pass on information separately about how you can go about doing that. Business councils like the New Zealand Pacific Council, really, really important partners and communications channels for us. So please, stay engaged with them, and we'll be trying to do a lot more with Daniel and with the other councils as well. And of course, for our partner agencies on the line, we're already in very close touch, but we are keen to stay in touch again and to think through some of the ideas about how we can work more closely together. And now my final slide, just really into the discussion, I think. So I've got a set of questions there. It'd be really, really great just to hear from some of the businesses that we've got on the line. This open mic day, some of the challenges that you're facing, and really, have there been any kind of wins or successes? And where are the areas that you think we can focus on to really try and maximise our value to you and to New Zealand and the region over the coming months? So that's it from me, and I might throw back to you, Daniel, or whoever would be moderating.
Awesome, thanks, David. Much appreciated. Great to get an insight in terms of that focus, and great to see the team and the skill set that you've built within that, and excited to see what that's going to mean for us going forward over the coming months and years. So anyone who's got a question who wants to ask it live, use the raise hand feature. We've got a couple of questions that have come through that we'll get the ball rolling with. The first one of those is what is the number one opportunity you've identified so far throughout your time so far in setting up the office and settling into the role, David?
Yeah, look, that's a great question. I mean, I think the number one opportunity really is around, how we can improve access into that aid and development agenda, and that's why we've prioritised it as a standalone piece of work that's going to be really important. And I think it's a major opportunity, not just because of the scale involved, but also because we know we're building from a pretty low base. We know already what some of those major challenges are in terms of companies being able to engage effectively with aid donors and procurers. And we've got a few ideas about how we can, really bridge some of those gaps in a way that'll be quite effective. So we've got a couple of models that we already use in our Australia market that we know companies value quite highly in terms of getting, intel into upcoming sort of project opportunities. And those are the sorts of approaches that we're thinking about replicating and building that sort of pipeline awareness into the aid and development agenda. So that would be probably the biggest one.
Awesome, thanks, David. And another question here from Anonymous. This is great. I like anonymous questions. NFAD have long had an ICT aspect to their Pacific Reset strategy. Do you have any insight into what that strategy means right now?
Thanks, Anonymous. That's not Anonymous, the organisation, is it? It's probably a good question for them. But look, No, I don't off the top of my head. I think, you know, so two things about MFAT. So many of you will probably have been present for the presentation that Jonathan Kings, the Deputy Secretary, gave when he was in Auckland, I think a couple of months ago. And he really sort of outlined quite effectively what's kind of happening with the New Zealand aid program at the moment. There's a real crisis response situation going on, I think. And so the aid program has pivoted quite significantly towards things like direct budget support, which is something that in ordinary non-crisis times it wouldn't contemplate. And that's basically just supporting governments like, you know, Fiji is one good example, with you know, money straight into the bank account effectively to help them deliver food parcels, support the health response, procure all of the immediate things that they need. And what that means is that a lot of you know, multi-year project type work has been put on hold, especially stuff that's required, I think, travel, whether it's from, you know, program designers or the like. But Jonathan's message was, put on hold means, you know, that in the next year or so, and very soon, they're gonna start, you know, looking back at those and kicking back off with a vengeance around how they can improve things around the economic recovery. When it comes to ICT specifically, I think that's probably going to vary by market. I'd need to check in with, I think, you know, whoever the sector leads are at MFAT on that. For example, I know there's a bit of work going on at the moment around the Pacific banking sector. So potentially some opportunities around fintech and improving, I think, you know, some of the challenges that are there in terms of e-commerce and just general banking in the region and remittance flows and the like. But more specific than that, I think we'll probably have to wait until you know, that immediate crisis mode's passed and MFAT goes back to its you know, sort of program funding.
Awesome, thanks, David. Just for those who've joined since the beginning, we're using an interactive app today called Slido. So if on the top of your screen next to your raise hand button, you see an S. If you click on that, it'll load up the question and answers and the polls. There is a poll that's live right now. For those of you who don't have that button, you can log in through your browser, sli.do, and it'll ask you for an access code, which is 888198, and you can interact, ask questions through that, and respond to the polls throughout today's event. Another question here, David, in regards to one of the biggest concerns from a trade export perspective is retaining shipping services into the region. Is this something that you have on your radar right now?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's probably, I think, the number one concern that's really focusing the minds of just about everyone that's looking at the region at the moment. So it's it's not something that anyone really can wave a wand and solve very easily. It's certainly, you know, not immediately within NZTE's gift to solve. I wish it was. What we have done is, you know, we've convened there's sort of an interagency working group that we've got. Myself, the NZTE team, the MFAT folk, you know, and you know, just getting everyone together. And we had a meeting last week, and a special session really on some of those freight issues. And it's you know, there's a whole host of challenges, from, you know, massive increases in container costs. I think, you know, Daniel, you and I have discussed some of those reductions to the break bulk, you know, shipping and what that means for people trying to ship, you know, stuff that doesn't easily fit in a box out to the region. There are major challenges that it's leading, you know, that it's generating for Pacific markets themselves. You know, particularly around things like fuel stocks, and also just, you know, getting Pacific products to market. So I know our colleagues at PT&I are very focused on that too. And yeah, there are discussions underway at the highest levels of government. I know our trade minister has been briefed on it. There are discussions happening through the Pacific Island Forum amongst all of the forum trade ministers and economic ministers as well. I'm aware the Secretary General of the forum is also, you know, directly focused on it too. So look, that's no promises that the issue is going to resolve very quickly. I think a lot of it, relates to global supply and demand dynamics, particularly around some of those containerization and shipping issues. But it's certainly on just about everyone's radar now.
Awesome. Thanks, Dave. We're going to head across to the floor. So if anyone's got any questions or any comments they'd like to make, it really an opportunity to share things that have been working, things that haven't been working, things you might like some assistance on, or that David or anyone else who's on the call might be able to provide some feedback for. So open up to the floor for anyone who's got anything to add. I can see Chanda there. I'm sure you've got some stories to tell or some questions to ask. I'll get you to come off mute there, Chanda.
Oh, sorry about that. Thank you, Daniel and David. In terms of the issues that people are facing, because if you see behind me the word Pacific, we walk across the Pacific, closer to home, Samoa, Fiji, and then a bit further away in Marshall Islands, Northern Marianas, Palau, so all across the Pacific. The issues we have faced is air travel, one, the availability of, to the price, airfares that were 2,000-3,000 retained before now are 10 to 15,000 retained. And then the biggest issue, once you have got the airfare, is not being able to come back home with the MIQ problem. That's a major, massive issue. And I think, David, you were in that session with the Minister for Economy from Fiji, where he actually reached out to the Business Council for us to reach out to the government and see if some things could be done so people from New Zealand can travel to Fiji, finish the capital walks there, and come home. But no Kiwi company wants to go because they know they don't know if and when they can come home. So that's an absolute major issue. Hopefully, it will die its natural death once we get 90% vaccinated. So I really think there is not much more there one can do. In terms of shipping, yeah, we're facing shipping because we export to all these countries. Shipping is an absolute bugbear for us, but we are getting good service, and those that are not members or customers of NZTE, I would strongly recommend that you do become one. And because what has happened is our customer manager at NZTE has been able to get us in touch with an logistics expert. This fellow was, managing director for Schenker for a number of years, and they arranged a bespoke, bespoke risk management plan. I mean, the issue is there. It's not a risk anymore. It's a issue, but they sort of come up with ways that really were low-hanging fruits, simple things that we could do. We're getting things out of Italy, India, Vietnam, all those countries, and into all these Pacific countries I mentioned. So Reinhold, which our customer manager, Richard Barron, was able to organize for us, was absolute nice, tangible benefit for us. So there is definitely, and this was organized for us, bespoke. So our managers got part of it, and there is follow-on to come from that, and paid for by NZTE. So I really strongly recommend to our colleagues, people listening in on this webinar, that if you have not become an NZTE customer, it's an absolute low-hanging fruit for you. You're paying for it. NZTE is an organization government funded, so you are funding it. And I'd strongly recommend that you take advantage of the services that NZTE provides. Once you become a customer, I mean, the doors are open to many more resources. So those are the two things: travel and shipping, and of course the support one can get from NZTE. Thanks for the opportunity, gentlemen.
Oh, thank you, Chanda. That's far better and more eloquently put than I did. Yeah, that's a very glowing endorsement, and I'll be sure to pass that on to Richard, who is an absolute gem of a resource for NZTE, and that, I think, just really does illustrate that benefit that can be provided, especially at the New Zealand end. Not necessarily just in market. That's great to hear about. The issues that you mentioned, particularly around MIQ availability, I mean, anyone only has to open a newspaper and see, what the challenges are there. And again, like the freight and shipping one, I don't know that that's anything that lends itself to an easy fix, other than, as you say, getting that vaccination rate up and getting to a point where we can reopen safely. You will be aware there are some schemes that are being trialled around time-sensitive, critical work allocations and things like that. So that's where there are projects that are absolutely critical and needing to be done in particular markets in the region. So it's predominantly realm countries such as Tokelau, Niue, Tuvalu, I think, is also included in that. Tonga, Samoa, and the Cooks. Well, the Cooks obviously has its own travel arrangement, but there are options, I think, as part of that to access special MIQ availability in limited capacity. But as you say, it's not a solution for everyone. It's not a solution for the entire region, and really, we do have to wait until things normalise a bit. In the meantime, the other thing that I would say is majorly advantageous to New Zealand companies. Many, and Pacific Engineering is a good example, have resources throughout the region that they've been able to draw on in some of those local markets. And there are partners that we've been able to connect people with that can provide some of that on the ground operation that we might in other times have sent expats to do. So one example that I can think of is there's a very sophisticated drone surveying company here in Fiji. We've connected them in with a couple of engineering consultancies who haven't been able to physically get to the country, but have been able to take advantage of some of that in-market work that the local partner's been able to deliver. And hopefully there are many other stories like that where some of those in-market presence or resources or connections have been able to achieve things.
Awesome. And yeah, just backing up that there is that trial underway, I believe, for selected customers in the region for MIQ spots. So yeah, I'm sure NZT has more information available on that if that's of interest to anyone. Colin, have you got a question down there in Wellington? I'll just get you to come off mute if that's all right.
Can you hear me now?
Perfect.
Okay. Yeah. My point relates to the third point there on the discussions up there. It's around travel. We've been operating the Pacific for almost 30 years, and we've got about 70 active accounts, and a lot of them are not big, but they require us to present ourselves. And we've actually done quite well because we've, from a business profitability standpoint, because we've saved a lot of money on travel. But what has happened is that our business is plateauing off. We're not getting any growth into new areas. And one even wonders if we don't sort of show up soon, whether they'll even forget us. So I know it's a difficult question to say when's travel going to open up. But there's two things there. It's both travel, and in our particular case, because we've got a mix of government and commercial customers, it's really the opening up of tourism. And until that happens, these island economies are dependent on aid organisations, ADB, World Bank, different countries, and their biggest source of income has been put aside. So, in other words, what I'm saying is that I see that we've stagnated, and I see the economies around the Pacific now are starting to fray around the edges, quite frankly. And so, how can we sort of, in an unknown COVID environment, how do you think we should actually sort of manage this?
It's a big question, Colin. I don't know that it's something that I've that anyone, let alone me, is qualified to know the answer to. But I mean, the point you make's absolutely right. The economies here have taken an absolute hammering. Fiji, for example, prior to the pandemic, around 40 to 50% of its economy was dependent on the tourism sector, and it's had a 97% drop in tourism arrivals from around close to 1 million people a year down to the sort of single digit thousands. And that's led to huge structural shifts in terms of how, masses of people no longer employed, of having to change, resorts that are shuttering, and just some of those flow-on things all the way down the chain, through to suppliers like yourselves. The comment you make about plateauing in terms of the business, I mean, I think that's an absolutely valid point. It's cold comfort, but you could be assured that you're not the only one, and there's certainly no one that's getting into the market, having all of those meetings in your absence. This is something that's really affecting everyone at the moment. Fiji, as it's dealing with its ongoing COVID outbreak, is effectively closed. Well, not closed. People can get in, but they haven't really been coming. But it is a signal that it'll be opening up from around about November or December this year. And I think, as I said earlier, that's actually looking more like a credible proposition at this stage, as its vaccination rate really ticks up. The challenge will be, as we know, as Chanda mentioned before, actually getting home at the end of it. But if you've got people that are keen to sort of come up for an extended period of time, then getting back into the market could well be a possibility, sort of, at some point in the nearer future.
David, I guess on that point, is there any strategy from an NZTE perspective around how we're going to protect New Zealand exporters once those borders open and it becomes easier for people from, for example, Australia? You've got it in the French territories right now where the borders are open. People from America are traveling there. That they're going to be the ones on the spot taking advantage of those opportunities, and us as New Zealand businesses are going to be restricted in our ability not to get there, but to get home.
Yeah, I think so. I'd be careful not to overstate, I think, how that's going to play out. I mean, so for example, Australia, right at the moment, is in the exact same boat as New Zealand in terms of people kind of not being able to get in or out. In fact, I think there's still a law in Australia that says Australians aren't legally allowed to leave the country. So it's even trickier for them at the moment. But depending on how things play out in the various states, you might see relaxations there, and the government in Canberra has announced a sort of a reopening plan that people will want to keep an eye on. In terms of people sort of coming from other markets, yes, I think there's definitely a role to be had around providing intel on what's happening and who's there. The reality is, I think that in a lot of Pacific markets, New Zealand companies, particularly those that are physically present, and there are many of them, are still very major players. And so, I think for the time being, we're just going to have to keep working through strategies, ideas, ways to try and maintain those connections to the best that we can. And, to the extent that I can help, being sort of physically based here in market, and working with, I think, some of the NZ Inc. colleagues across the region, we're really keen, I think, to see how we can provide some of that support, whether it's connecting people up on calls like this, whether it's just providing some of that intel around opportunities that are coming down the track, and also just, I think, providing that regular advice back into the government about what the implications are of the ongoing economic situation.
Awesome. Thanks, David. And we've got a question here from Chris Service. Do you have any updates on the PRAF MFAT workpiece on the deteriorating insurance market in the Pacific?
Chris, I don't. I can follow that one up. But I know, just one little shout out for you. Hopefully people are aware that PRIF, Pacific Regional Infrastructure Facility, is hosting it has the PRIF week coming up in mid-October. So for anyone that's sort of interested in kind of dynamics in the infrastructure sector in the region, for some of these kind of conversations, particularly around the impacts of COVID, can I please just give a shout out for that event? It takes place over a full week, I think from 11th to 15th of October. Please consider dialing in. It's been all over LinkedIn, but we're going to look at getting some comms out as well around that. I know that MFAT is working with the PRIF on a project around improving sort of private sector capability in the region. I don't know where that's at in terms of the insurance stuff, but let me check into that if you like.
Awesome, thanks, David. And just a quick reminder, if you're on Slido, we've got some polls running there, and send your questions through. Pass across to Maria. Thanks for the hand raise there.
Thank you, Daniel. I would like to, I don't have questions, but I just like to introduce myself. I'm new to Auckland. I'm the Council and Senior Trade Commissioner from Canada, based in Auckland. And I'm also a Council in the Kingdom of Tonga, Samoa, Republic of Kiribati, Tuvalu, and to the Republic of the Fiji Islands. So I just want to say hello to everybody. And I have the same similar role as David Dewar in Fiji, and promote trade between Canada and New Zealand, and hopefully with some of the Pacific Islands as well. So thank you for this very informative session on New Zealand's and Pacific Islands trade and investment. That's it.
Oh, look, kia ora Maria, and thanks very much for that, and welcome to New Zealand and to the region. Really good to sort of meet you in this format, and I'd be really keen to connect separately. For those who are on the line, you know, Canada's got some very significant interests in the region, particularly in the sort of the mining and the resources sectors. So, you know, we'll be looking at sort of seeing, you know, how, you know, what sort of opportunities we can look at in terms of connecting some of our kind of service utilities type companies into some of those partners as well. So yeah, a lot of opportunity there, and really look forward to staying in touch with you, Maria.
Yeah, thank you very much, David.
Awesome. We've got anyone else from the floor who'd like to have their say, share any stories or experiences, or ask any questions of anyone who's on the call? Anything from your side, Devon?
I just think the sooner we can get back to business in the Pacific. I mean, we've identified all the main challenges, but it seems a long time since we've been there doing work, been able to achieve that extra level of business in that region. So I think just to hope that COVID settles soon and we can get everybody vaccinated, and hope that we can move forward in completing and doing more business in the region. And NZTE, I think I'd endorse Chanda's comments around what they can provide as services and contacts, especially. NZTE sit on the New Zealand Pacific Business Council as an advisory organisation. They've been really good for us to be able to have contacts into government about when our members face challenges, and certainly in my former organisations I've used them extensively, and so just like to endorse them as well. Thank you. That's all.
Thanks, Devon. Colin, you got another question there? Get you to come off mute. Sorry, Colin.
How's that?
Perfect.
Okay, good. Yeah, question for David. When things get back to some normality, I agree with Devon's opening point there. It's very, very difficult to progress your business up there without presenting yourself. But for David, is he planning on doing quite a bit of travel within the islands when when he's able to travel? And I'm thinking specifically here of New Caledonia, which has been an absolute headache of a market for us. And they want to do business, but we've got very, very difficult barriers at the border there in the terms of all sorts of customs charges, and it's just very, very difficult. There's no NZTE representation there. Used to be, but it's an area where we actually need it, and also roll that into the language as well. Don't have the language problem so much up in Tahiti, but certainly you can run into it in New Caledonia. So there's a lot of hurdles there. Is David going to be doing a lot of work in New Caledonia?
Colin, it's funny that you mentioned that. I'm actually speaking to our Consul General, who's a very good friend of mine, Felicity Roxburgh, later this afternoon, and the team in Noumea. So the short answer is yes, absolutely. New Caledonia, the French Pacific more broadly, is our third largest trading partner in the region. Fiji, I mentioned, number one, Papua New Guinea, number two. And on a good year, actually, the French Pacific can be even higher than PNG. So huge numbers of New Zealand companies and New Zealand exports going to those markets. Absolutely, it'll be a priority for us. Yes, I'll definitely try and get there at some point once I've got that opportunity to travel myself. But in the meantime, really looking at using how we can use our NZ Inc. Networks to achieve some of those objectives in those markets. Colin, if I could ask you, maybe if you wanted to flick me a quick note after this to my email with anything sort of pressing that you'd like us to raise with the Consul General when we speak to her this afternoon, I'd be very happy to do that.
I'll do that, David.
Yeah, on that, Felicity and her team are a great resource to have up there as well, and they're really open to connections and assisting where they can. So found them great to deal with over the last. Felicity's been up there for 6 months or so. So it's great to have their support on board up in that market. Anything from you, Marty or Kevin?
Are you talking to me?
Yeah, what's happening in your world, Marty?
Well, I wanted to ask a question on the discussion, all those discussion points, and on following on what Colin was saying, based on a trade mission of some sort when we're allowed to get there, and also obviously coming back into New Zealand through MIQ. Surely the government, we could be the first cab off the rank to get up to these islands, big markets for us these days, and obviously we're starting to lose some of that market share. I just wondered if there's any thought to something like that, where we just charter as I say, the first cab off the rank up there.
Sorry, Marty, you cut out a little bit while you were asking that question, but I definitely got the gist of it. So talking about possible trade missions up to the region, being first cab off the rank. Look, yes, absolutely. That is very much in our frame. Obviously, it's all going to depend on the reopening and things like that back in New Zealand. But my pitch back into NZTE and to MFAT is that not only are these very significant and important markets for us, they are, we also have that kind of strategic interest and responsibility to the region's economic recovery. And trade and value chains in the region are going to be a critical part of that. So absolutely, I'd love this region to be, first cab off the rank. Whether that's, a mission to Fiji, which makes most sense for me, or also some of those other markets that we have been talking about. Just in the meantime, while on the subject of trade missions, you'll probably be aware that we've done a couple of virtual ones, or we've done one virtual one at least, with the Solomon Islands. Look, it's no substitute, I know, for getting on a plane and going, to the regions, but it's probably the best alternative in the circumstances. There is thought being given into another one with the French Pacific as well. So just wanted to signal that it's some way off still, but that's definitely something that we're thinking about at the moment, and I'll be talking to Felicity about that today too.
Which markets, Marty, are of key interest for you guys? Just right. We'll swap across to Josh. get you to take yourself off mute there.
Okay, sounds like you should be hearing me. My question was just basically in the meantime one. You mentioned how the New Zealand aid program is potentially doing budget support for governments, and I'm just curious if that's the case with intergovernmental donors. So presumably DFAT's doing the same, but ADB, World Bank, I mean, presumably these are a lot of projects that have ground to a halt. You can't play a consultant in, you know, so that's a lot of kind of budgeted spend blocked essentially. I'm just curious if those other donors and other players are participating in propping up balance sheets to keep governments ticking along, or if they are just blocked and not spending. What's going on in the interim stage, please?
Yeah, good question, Josh. And I know you had a week heads up to think up a good one, so that's a good one. The short answer is yes. So you know, the same challenges that the New Zealand aid program's facing, everyone else is facing as well. Australia has pivoted to, you know, budget support in the same way. Australia is actually it's a little bit different to New Zealand in that it's got a lot more sort of aid intermediaries in the region. So it's got these big facilities, you know, here in Fiji and in other countries, you know, which are administered by big prime contractors like Palladium, Cardno, and the like, which have been able to sort of maintain program type operations with their in-country resources. But yes, they're doing budget support in exactly the same way that New Zealand is. ADB and World Bank, budget support's actually their standard MO, really. They've been doing budget support forever. I mean, they're banks after all, and so they've got both a big loan book as well as grant funding and grant related budget support too. So in fact, you know, I know that when New Zealand and Australia, you know, we're going through that consideration of shifting to a budget support approach, it was the ADB that provided a lot of the advice on how to do that effectively. But you know, in short, and if anything, they're coming thick and fast. So a lot of the stuff that the ADB does is also, it does giant loans to big companies actually as well in the region. So you might be aware Fiji Airways received a $70 million loan from the ADB earlier this year. And, you know, a lot of that's really about, you know, maintaining some of that economic activity, as well as, you know, the program funding. So this big project that's coming up in Kiribati, big renewable energy project, ADB funded. Absolutely, that's progressing. And for those that, you know, are interested in dialing into that webinar, there'll be also a presentation from ADB's Suva office, a guy by the name of Eric Albers, who you might have come across, and he'll be giving a sense of that project pipeline in the region. But no, there are huge increases in both loan and grant funding going into the region to offset some of that economic impact.
Awesome, thanks, Josh. Great question. We've got anyone else who wants to ask any questions or add any contributions to the conversation? Anything from Kevin or from Glynis?
Thank you, Danielle, and hi, David. Long time no see, like 24 hours ago. Look, I endorse the earlier speakers, including the points raised by David, and thank you for a very concise and succinct presentation. Just a couple of points to add on this aid development discussion. One is maybe the council would, through David's office or elsewhere, should give some consideration to looking into the disaster risk finance options that the region rolled out, of which New Zealand is a party to. And there's a lot of options in there for private sector access to development finance around disaster risk management, including for insurance. The other point is on the shipping challenges. Absolutely right. There's no real solutions, short-term solutions in sight. And David's point about the parties having to come together to think this through and come up with regional solutions is absolutely correct. I was talking to Tuvalu the other day, and interestingly, some of the governments in the Pacific are now giving serious consideration to come up with solutions like their own national shipping agency or shipping companies to counter the dependence they currently have on this inter-regional shipping routes that a lot of them are highly dependent on. And so governments in the Pacific are looking to use current interconnectivity and jumping on board. And so one example is the Nauru shipping line, which has a direct service route between Nauru and Australia, and then comes all the way down to Fiji. And some of the Pacific Island countries are in discussions at the government level to connect that same route. Some of the soft landing options is, and where it affects specific businesses in New Zealand businesses included, is freight assistance packages that are available to small business, to businesses around the Pacific, and can be made available to New Zealand companies who have a presence in the Pacific. So we're going to be rolling out some grant schemes in the coming months. The other one I just wanted to mention is around connectivity, and I think this point was raised earlier, and it's absolutely correct. There's a huge body of work and train around connectivity, e-commerce, digital trade, and all of that, that's wrapped in a regional strategy and a roadmap already identified, of which New Zealand made a huge contribution to. So in terms of ICT and connectivity, there's a two-prong approach that's currently in train. One is at the national level, and the other is regional. Both offer opportunities, as I see it, for New Zealand companies to get involved in. And David, we can stay on top of this topic as it evolves. UNCTAD out of Geneva has put aside an awful amount of aid to help the Pacific roll out its connectivity program. So when those opportunities come on board, and it will in the coming months, and PACER Plus is going to hold play an instrumental role in this. So David, your office and I can stay in communication on this matter, because funding programs are going to roll out on the implementation side, and New Zealand companies who have presence in the Pacific Island countries, I think this is a huge opportunity for them to consider. On the travel restrictions, absolutely. All that's been said is you can't reinforce it anymore. And the reality is that it's holding up progress in the Pacific Island countries, and the inability of New Zealand, and not only New Zealand, Australia, and wherever else, the transfer of those technical assistants or technical persons across borders, the movement of people across borders in the professional field is a real issue. So how do we overcome that? Well, in the short term, there are, as David mentioned, discussions at the ministerial level, and New Zealand and Australia, as we all know, have their own guidelines to follow, and I don't see this issue resolving in the short term, as we all know. So unfortunately, we just have to ride that wave. In terms of the trade missions, our office had organized a trade mission to the Trade and Investment Mission to the Cook Islands just before this current lockdown. If any businesses in New Zealand are interested to travel to the Cook Islands, we were taking a couple of New Zealand companies along with us. Just drop me an email and we'll see how we can expand that, to deliver on any interests you might have in the Cook Islands. And for Cook Islands, the opportunities that are coming through, as we see it, are in the investment side, services, in the trade in services, and in infrastructure. There's a big infrastructure projects that the government of Cook Islands is rolling out, water, sewage, and a couple of others. I think that's all from me, Daniel, for the time being, and thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks, Glynis. Much appreciated. Giles, I might be throwing you on the spot here, but do you have anything to add on the shipping conversation?
Thanks, Daniel. I thought you might ask. Yeah, I'm relatively new to the council, so thanks for that, and good to see some old faces and some new. You look, it's frustrating because the service levels have certainly dropped, and I think it's a global phenomenon. It's not just within the region, you know, and prices globally have been increased. I would also add that, you know, shipping isn't rocket science either. It's moving things from A to B, and so a lot of people are afraid of taking on that shipping challenge, and I think it's something when you're speaking with the right people, you know, can be easily explained and executed. But it is a problem, and I've heard myself of what's called a Central Pacific Shipping Commission, which has been involved in Fiji through the SPC, with the Central Pacific Islands and the Micronesian Shipping Commission involved in sort of regulating regional shipping as well. What's the solution? Very difficult. I mean, I think it's collaboration between the different countries for sure. It's maintaining competition, so there is some competition in the field, and I think, yeah, councils like this and various chambers of commerce, yeah, individually within the Pacific Islands have a role to play in making sure that's priority. And I think you know, we've all seen that over the last 20 odd months, that shipping is the essential lung of the community because of the air freight or lack of air freight over that period as well. So. Yeah, I think, you know, the services are still there. I think the frequency is a problem, and that's largely due to congestion issues that we've had, you know, in New Zealand, which have, you know, obviously been very public in the media, but also regionally too. So, yeah, wish I could add some more reassurance, but I think it's going to be ongoing for a wee while. That's a rumor has it that after Chinese New Year 2022 things should improve, but yeah, it's frustrating. And Colin, to your point, yeah, I mean, I lived and worked in the Pacific Islands, and specifically French Pacific for some time, and agreed, you know, if you don't know the language, it's quite difficult to conduct business. And I think that's what's the beauty of this kind of forum and the council is establishing those connections and making sure that you have the right people in the right place. And if I can just add one final point from my own experience, I mean, I used to run a shipping line called Pacific Direct Line. We service 22 countries around the Pacific, and our success was actually built on the agencies. So we employed up to 700 people at one point. And hearing the comments around the inability to travel just makes me wonder whether the whole model needs to be revisited a little bit in terms of representation locally. And obviously everyone's operating on a different scale, but actually having somebody on island representing your business, maybe not just your business, but a group of different businesses, might be a good investment to have that presence on the ground where you can't actually travel yourself. Thanks, Daniel.
Thanks, Giles. That's a really a couple of really good observations there. I think, you know, the first one, the shipping issue really is a global problem, and, you know, in a weird and perverse way, it's actually a bit advantageous to New Zealand at the moment. If you think it's costly to get goods from New Zealand into the islands, it's a hell of a lot more expensive to get them from Asia, or from Europe, or from the States at the moment. So, you know, a lot of those kind of competitor products are suffering as much, if not more so, from some of those freight challenges. So there's potential. You know, I wouldn't use the word opportunity, but it's definitely, you know, something to bear in mind. And then I think the second one, you know, talking about some of that, you know, local representation being a potential solution. You know, there's never been a better time to hire people in this part of the world at the moment. So if anyone is thinking about that at the moment, then that's definitely something that I know a lot of companies that I talk to are considering as well. So yeah, good to bear in mind.
Yeah, that was great. Thanks, Giles. And something that our company in particular is looking at the moment is how we go about putting a workforce on the ground up there, just to be responsive. And it's probably more cost effective. You're going to be easier accessible to your customers in the short term and the longer term, and with the right support. So that's some great advice there. Kevin, anything from your side?
Well, firstly, I must apologise. I've been in and out of this webinar for the last hour and a half as a manufacturer, just in Auckland, just starting up operations today with a couple of hundred employees back on site. Oh, sorry, 100 or so. Things have been just a lot of things have been happening, which is great from our perspective. It's good to be able to start manufacturing again. The biggest issues, I guess, we're facing are just the same. I mean, shipping, costs of shipping, shipping delays, particularly now more so with storage costs from freight forwarders, with those vessel delays. So it's a continual moving thing, which you've just got to be so careful of, particularly with regards to your pricing. Projects wise for us around the Pacific, yes, we've still got a few on, but so many that are on hold waiting for different decisions, I guess, and funding, because as most of us know, with tourism not being opened up, everything just comes to a standstill and people don't really want to spend, and with uncertainty, it just causes more complications than that for us. But I think the big issue, as outlined by a number of you before, is it's just so difficult to trade. We have used webinars, Zoom meetings, phones, smoke signals, just about every other method we can to communicate and get things across. But it's just so difficult without being on the ground. And who in this day and age could send somebody overseas with the realistic chance they might not be able to get back at any particular time? So from our perspective, I guess we really do need to look at some channel for businesses to be able to at least get their people out and back to the country with some sort of certainty. As I say, the one thing of businesses they don't like is uncertainty. That's probably about all I can add to this. So thanks everybody, and my apologies again for dropping in and out.
Well, thanks from me, Kevin. I think if you hadn't told us, we wouldn't have known, because I think all of those questions definitely, sounded like you've been listening very intently to the whole thing. So look, great. Awesome to hear that the operation's able to sort of restart for you back in Auckland now. I mean, I think that's got to be one of the biggest and most immediate challenges for a lot of people, is that just immediate lockdown that you're coping with. So no, that's great to hear. Yeah, I think absolutely right. Those just that importance of being on the ground is so vital. Again, I sort of come back to that same point I made around freight. It's an issue that's affecting everyone, not just Kiwis. New Zealand businesses. In fact, even here in Fiji, up until last week, I wasn't even allowed to leave the house because of the ongoing outbreak here. Given we've effectively been in a level 4 lockdown since about April. So a lot of those in-person meetings, even in the country here, haven't been going ahead for a long time. So it's definitely something that's impacting everyone. As you say, I think we've just got to look at how quickly we can get back to a situation where you can get back to those in-person conversations, and then what, if anything, we can do in the meantime to keep those connections going.
Awesome. Thanks, David. We'll just flip back to Glynis before we come back to David for closing. Once again, thanks everyone for attending today. Great for us as New Zealand Pacific Business Council to be able to host David in his first mass audience event, of which I'm sure he'll have plenty over the coming months and years. And once again, if you're not currently a member of the council, I do encourage you to get in touch and join up, and the link to that is in the Q&A on Slido. But I'll pass across to Glynis.
Thank you, Daniel. I just wanted to add on the French territory discussions on the opportunities with them. Our office offers a free of charge, of course, a French translation facility, and because we have a French-speaking staff member, and since bringing Ord on board, our trade, or the Pacific region's trade with New Caledonia has just gone through the roof. So I just offer that to the council members, that if anyone is struggling with language or wanting documents translated or wanting an interpreter, our office can facilitate and provide that service for you. David, while on New Caledonia, I reminded that I owe you a document. So ahead of your discussion with Felicity this afternoon, I'll send you that concept note following our earlier discussions with Scott, okay? That's it from me. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Glynis. Awesome. Coming to the end of our time together, huge thanks to everyone attending and massive thanks to David for his presentation and willing participation in the conversation. And it's awesome to have someone in the role who cares about the region and has the ability to understand businesses' needs. So huge thank you on behalf of all of us, David, and any closing words from your side?
I'll just stop my share so that I can actually see multiple faces. But look, no, nothing really other than to say thank you very much again from me for everyone who's dialed in today. It's been fantastic to have had the welcome that I've had in this role, to have got to engage with so many companies that are, in businesses that are doing, such great work and have been for a very long time in the region. I didn't really mention at the start, my background is with New Zealand Foreign Affairs and Trade Ministry. I worked for them for 15 years prior to coming on board with NZTE into this role. Spent a lot of time in Australia, and obviously back in New Zealand. But so look, I'm really keen to connect. I'm keen to do that in a way that makes most sense and doesn't do sort of injustice to everyone. So, really engaging with the business councils, engaging through NZTE if possible, is the best way to get in touch. Really encourage you to do that. I'll send out some information via Daniel and Christine after this about how to do that. And otherwise, really keen just to stay in contact with you all, and hopefully there'll be a few more of these discussions in the future. So, tēnā koutou katoa.